Thank you very much, Monty and Scott. Thank you, those of you who are here. I join you today Zooming from Alutiiq in Western Oregon. Let's see if my slides will cooperate. Okay, then. Today I'm going to talk about Alutiiq ancestral use of birds at the Rice Ridge Archaeological Site on Kodiak. I want to start by thanking a bunch of people. Marie and Dale Rice are the landowners who permitted excavation back in 1989 through 1991. The folks at the Alutiiq Museum, Amy Steffian, Patrick Saltonstall, Molly Odell, and Amanda Lancaster all have helped out in different ways. Philomena Hausler, of course, excavated the site along with Rick Knick, Don Clark, and various others. I'd like to thank Lesnoy Inc., Kodiak Inc., and the Kodiak Area Native Association who supported the project of the excavation. And then at the University of Washington Burke Museum, where the Rice Ridge faunal remains are curated, Laura Phillips and Robert Fawcett. My students, Amy Shannon, Brittany Falconer, Eric Wonderly at the University of Oregon, and my colleague Molly Casperson at the University of Oregon, and then my colleague Scott Blumenthal and Jensen Wainwright, who have done the pilot isotopic analysis that I will briefly discuss in the talk. And finally, last but not least, Bob Copperell, who made possible the return of the Rice Ridge faunal remains back to the Northwest from New York City, where they were housed and languished for a number of years. So Rice Ridge is located here on the northeastern corner of Kodiak Island, just south of Kodiak, along the shores of Shiniak Bay. It's about 300 meters from the modern shoreline, but at the time it was occupied, it was situated along the shoreline of a now drained lagoon. Excavation occurred in various parts of the site, and there were 4 excavation areas that I'll point out here. And here in detail 1, these excavation units. These 4 units here, 2x2 units, were the ones that Bob Copperell analyzed for mammal and fish bones during his analysis that was reported in his dissertation. And so what we did is we focused our bird remains analysis on these same excavated units. Philomena Hausler Knick, at the time, then a graduate student at Harvard, led the excavation. Don Clark, the famous father of Kodiak archaeology, who just died recently, also excavated along with Rick Knick and a crew of several others. Hausler never completed a site report, and the first person to tackle the analysis was Bob Copperell. These are some of the artifacts from the site that represent the Ocean Bay 1 and Ocean Bay 2 time periods. Of special note are these microblades over here on the right that can be inset in points like this. As well, we see these sea mammal hunting harpoons, and we see in Ocean Bay 2 both chipstone and ground slate lances. Oh, there's my inset of the microblades into that bone point. Copperell obtained 22 radiocarbon dates from the site and worked out the stratigraphy and chronology. He identified 3 time periods of occupation, 2 in Ocean Bay 1 and 1 in Ocean Bay 2, the earliest roughly 7,000 to 6,700 cal BP, and then a hiatus, and then this middle strata from 5,800 to 5,700 cal BP, and then a later occupation, 4,900 to 4,300 cal BP. Analysis of the Rice Ridge birds started in my 2019 zooarchaeology course at the University of Oregon. We had thousands of bones, and our first task was to identify them to element. The more than 4,700 bones identified to element were individually labeled with their catalog numbers and then identified to taxon. We did this using our North Pacific Comparative Collection at the University of Oregon, as well as 28 species borrowed from the University of Washington's Burke Museum Ornithology Laboratory. This slide gives you a sense of the scale of the effort. We had 2 sets of tables like this. We've recorded 3,734 bird bones to taxon, representing 13 bird families, 33 genera, and 25 species. The most common categories are cormorants, ducks, murres, and geese. But before I present the Rice Ridge results, I want to draw your attention to a brilliant paper by Carolyn Funk, who we just heard from. In it, Professor Funk describes Alutiiq use of birds as food, as sources of skins, feathers, bones, beaks, talons, etc. Some of these products used to make tools and jewelry. The paper does far more than this, but a major point is highlighted here, which really has awesome implications and blew my students and I away. Across 20 years, one person would need 400 to 500 birds for basic clothing in an Alutiiq village. A group of people living in even a small village of 20 or 30 people would need 8,000 to 15,000 birds every 2 years. From the start, we assumed that birds at Rice Ridge were used for their skins and other byproducts, as well as the meat they provided, but this is certainly varied by species and time period. I also want to point out that our analysis is not yet complete. I have some slides near the end of this talk that pose questions, and I'm hoping that those listeners with experience on Kodiak and the Alutiiq region will help me address these. If not today, maybe at another time. Okay, so again, cormorants were the most common. They make up 29% overall at the assemblage, followed by ducks at 28%, murres at 15%, geese at 12%, and other taxa at 17%. And those other taxa include this makes up about 10%, all the birds on this slide. So small alcids, including this list of murrelets and auklets, gulls and kittiwakes at about 3%, and loons at 3%, with most of those being the common loon. The other birds making up that remaining 7% include tundra swan, ptarmigan, grebes, albatross, northern fulmar and shearwater, a couple of small sandpipers, bald eagle, gyrfalcon, and raven. In terms of ducks, the 2 most common species that we got, 2 species, are the common eider at 26%, by far the most abundant, and the white-winged scoter. Both are large ducks, and if we lump together large ducks, eiders, and scoters, they make up about 58% of the ducks. Today, some common eider are year-round residents of Kodiak Island, and white-winged scoters are the most abundant scoters on Kodiak today. More than 90% of the ducks are sea ducks. Geese are difficult to identify as species based on morphological criteria. Of the cranial elements, several did appear to be emperor geese, but we could not confirm this. For making parkas, Yupik people today prefer emperor geese over the more thin-skinned Canada goose and white-fronted goose, whose skins tear easily. On Kodiak today, many hunters, sports hunters, are highly interested in the recovery of emperor geese populations that are still considered near threatened. Because emperor goose diets are more marine than those of other geese, we did a pilot isotopic study of goose bones to try to identify emperors. While most geese in the Arctic feed on tundra vegetation, emperor geese feed on invertebrates, marine grasses, and algae. For comparison, we measured the isotopic signatures of cormorants because they feed on marine fish and invertebrates. There is one goose specimen that has somewhat higher carbon and nitrogen values than do the rest of the geese, and this may be an emperor goose, but we would have to examine a larger sample to better assess the frequency of the species among the Rice Ridge geese. Cormorants could be red-faced, pelagic, or double-crested. Today, there are pelagic cormorant colonies within 3 kilometers of the site on these islands just offshore Rice Ridge. Murres were also identified to genus. Today, there's a small colony of common murres on those same islands that I pointed out within 3 kilometers of the site. Archaeologists believe Ocean Bay people lived in skin tents with oval, circular, or teardrop-shaped floors with charcoal and red ochre stains, food, bone, and artifacts. Hausler described red ochre-covered surfaces complete with post holes and rectangular slab hearths. She stated that they were not simply stained with ochre, but uniformly covered with a very oily coating of red ochre. This coating was sometimes applied to the sides of the hearth rocks as well. She found red ochre processing tools, including grooved ochre grinding slabs and handheld pounding stones. Hausler interpreted these floors as living floors of surface structures like skin tents, as opposed to semi-subterranean houses. Unfortunately, I don't have a photo of such a red ochre floor from Rice Ridge. Thanks to Amy Staffian and Patrick Saltonstall, we do have a great photo of a red ochre floor from this site here, Kodiak 1130, and you can see that red here. Years ago, Amy Staffian wrote, many sites contain layers of red ochre. It often covers structure floors and may have been used to tan hides for bedding or tent coverings. And then more recently, Amy and Patrick wrote, red ochre floors are common in Ocean Bay sites and reflect the processing of iron oxide into a red powder. The function of this powder is unknown, although it may have been used to tan hides used for tent and floor coverings. Whatever its function, the presence of an ochre-covered floor and ochre processing tools are indicative of the earliest stage in Kodiak prehistory. So, in asking Kodiak archaeologists about this, I really appreciate the precious information Patrick shared with me on email based on his experience excavating Kodiak sites. He wrote to me, you find red ochre surfaces at most Ocean Bay sites, but not all. We did not find them at Amac site where people were smoke processing sea mammals. Red ochre is associated with living floors where people slept. It may be related to tanning hides. Referencing the site in the previous slide I just showed, he described this as a Pompeii-like house, the least disturbed I know. Most Ocean Bay sites are a mess of red ochre floors everywhere, and everything is disturbed by later occupations. Finally, red ochre is associated with living surfaces where people slept and worked, not with where they processed or butchered fish or sea mammals. So I find this really interesting. And so I wanted to ask, and I can't read my questions here because of the Zoom slide, but I'm kind of asking, is the red ochre from the actual tanning process, the making of tanning of hides, or is the red ochre bleeding off hides that have already been tanned that make up the bedding or blankets used in a structure? And so more specifically talking about Rice Ridge, is red ochre used to tan all hides, so that of seal and caribou in addition to the bird skins, or just some type? And of course, we have to ask if it was used to tan bird skins also. Certainly, Ocean Bay people had a variety of marine mammals from which they made skin. They used the skins. They used bear skins. Some small mammals are represented, and these could be sources of hides and skins. And in looking at Bob Copperell's analysis from his dissertation, we see that 63% of the mammal NISP was sea otter, followed by harbor seal, stellar sea lion, bear, and other. And so we could ask, is red ochre being used to tan sea otter, seal, or sea lion, or even bear skins? Is the red ochre staining from blankets processed with red ochre that bled onto the floors? Petroff and Holmberg noted that Alutiiq people wore birdskin parkas, feathers side out in wet weather, like on the left, and the skin side out in dry weather, like on the right. Red pigment, presumably ochre, was used to decorate bird skins, and at Rice Ridge, red ochre stained bird bones are found. Whether the bones were incidentally or deliberately stained is unclear. Red ochre may have been used as flour is today when working with bird skins to help remove the moisture when softening the skin according to Fina Briorden for the Yupik. Red ochre and grease were used together to waterproof skins according to Kodiak. So if red ochre floors are living surfaces where people slept and worked, then what do the midden layers represent? And I'll back up and say that Copperell, following Hauser, and others found these alternating layers of what's called red ochre floors and midden at Rice Ridge. And so I ask, if floors represent winter residences, are the middens the result of debris discarded later in the year in another season? If floors represent residence, are middens the result of debris discarded when the residence had to be vacated or was unoccupied for another reason? Do the floors represent working areas where skin clothing was made using ochre, but not necessarily residences? Is midden deposited because it helps fill in low spots, improve drainage, or prevent water from accumulating in pits? Note that each of the 3 time periods starts with a red ochre floor and ends with a midden, which I find interesting. And finally, does the distribution of the bird remains in floors versus midden provide any evidence relevant to these hypotheses? So basically, I'm asking if we can not only learn about bird use, but learn about site formation by looking at the birds. So we can look at the distribution of the different species or the different types of birds and middens and floors across the 3 time periods. Now, overall, there's not much a difference. In terms of total numbers, there's not much a difference between the relative frequencies of the different groups in the middens of the floors. But if we look more closely to the early period, for example, cormorants here are in blue, this deeper blue. You can see that there are more cormorants, 44%, represented in the floor than in the midden. In terms of ducks, there are more ducks in the midden, more ducks and mures in the midden than there are in the floor. So there's a difference during the early period. In the middle period, there's really a more equitable distribution between middens and floors. We don't see much difference there. If we look at the late period, we see there are more ducks and geese. The red is the ducks and the purple are the geese. We see more in the floors than the middens. So there are these differences that we see across time in the distribution, and I haven't figured out what this pattern means. I'm hoping that there still might be time that I can hear from those of you who have experience with red ochre floors to share your knowledge with me. But if not, I have my email address here, and I'd love to hear from you any feedback you have about what these patterns mean and what recommendations you might have for sources I need to pursue. One of the things I haven't pursued is how people process sea otters, in how the Alutiiq people and their ancestors processed sea otters prior to the industrial era. I'd love to know how that was done, and I hadn't had a chance to research that yet. So thank you for listening. Again, if you have any feedback, I'd love hearing from you, and thank you for being here.
All right, thank you, Madonna. Great presentation. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so we'll have to move right on to Jason Rogers' paper. But yeah, please do email Madonna if you have any feedback for her on those ochre floors. Thank you, Madonna.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Monty.